Welcome to this Te Pūtiyaki Mana Taonga Association of Educators Beyond the Classroom webinar. Ko Helen Lloyd tōku ingoa. I'm one of the learning facilitators for the Te Pūtiyaki Mana Taonga project team. And this is number 24 in our webinar series. And today we're going to be talking about supporting learners to think critically about our histories. So in a moment, I will be introducing our speakers, but before I do that, we'll start with a karakia. And just to remind everybody that this webinar will be recorded and uploaded onto our YouTube channel for people to watch who can't make the live event. And if you've got any questions or comments, please type them in the chat and we'll come to them later on. He karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora. Well, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our speakers today, and they may be familiar with you already. All three have actually presented webinars for us in the past. And today they're coming together as a team to give this presentation. So we'll start introducing from the right, Ricky Prebble. He's going to be our first speaker today. Ricky is an educator and a historian with Manatū Taonga, and he's based at Pukeahu War Memorial Park here in Wellington. He designs education programs for schools at the Pukeahu Education Centre, and he also writes history and teaching material for Te ākonga. Today he's going to talk a bit about our histories, monuments and objects that he teaches with, and he's going to enable us to think about how we frame our thinking around them. And he's going to highlight some of the silences involved in those monuments. Next up, we've got Laura Jones. Laura Jones has been a teacher for many years and taught a wide range of groups, and she has an arts specialism. She studied and has a passion for museum education. She loves communicating big ideas with students, and today she's going to demonstrate the pedagogical technique she uses within the Gallipoli exhibition at Te Papa, and use it as an example of drawing out deeper thinking and critical thinking with students. And finally, we have Tereora. Tereora is a senior specialist at the Culture and Heritage He Tohu Tamaki exhibition in Auckland. He runs education programs for ākonga of all ages, as well as professional development for teachers from primary right through to tertiary regarding te tiriti or waitangi. He's going to wrap up the presentation today with his thoughts about the powerful roles and responsibilities that we have as educators within the culture and heritage sector in relation to teaching histories and facilitating critical thinking. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker.
Kia ora everyone, kia ora Helen, kei te mihi ki a koe, me te tima Te Pūtiyaki Mana Taonga, I tēnei whaiwahi. I ngā kai kōrero Tereora, rawa ko Laura, tēnei te mihi ki a porua. So hi everyone, really excited to be able to have the opportunity to share some whakaaro on this kaupapa today, critical thinking and history. So as an educator and historian for the Ministry for Culture and Heritage, this is obviously an area that I'm really interested in. You can see the picture here is of sort of the backyard from where I work, Pukeahu National War Memorial Park. There's the Carillon Tower, that's the National War Memorial. And the whole park itself is filled with historical markers. So historical markers, you know, another word for memorials or statues or monuments, things that have been put into the landscape as a kind of way in which to indicate to people something should be remembered. So I'm going to spend, the first part of this presentation just talking about ways in which I work with students to interrogate these monuments. And then I'll touch on a couple of key historical concepts, in particular, the idea of historical change and perspectives. So I hope that some of what I share will be relevant for your mahi. If you're working in a museum space or some kind of highly curated space, there may be some transference in terms of what I mention today. So to begin with monuments, something that I'm very clear in talking to students about is that the monuments that we go and see in the park, and also that are scattered throughout our cities and towns, represent particular views of a community's past and present, but the views tend to be those of elite, powerful, economic, socially or politically powerful groups who have put into the landscape these figures or these I guess markers that serve as a collective kind of memory to say to the public, hey, remember this person or remember this event. They're trying to sort of convey a sense of who or what was important. But while we explore Pukeahu Park, for instance, thinking about what is in the park, it's very important also to consider what's not there. And there are many, many silences. For instance, there's no memorial to the Aotearoa New Zealand land wars. Here we are in the National War Memorial Park, but all of the markers are explicitly referencing conflict that has occurred elsewhere. So it's straight away a pretty interesting omission, and to talk with students about why might that be, it's very interesting. Also, there's no memorial to conscientious objectors, those who opposed war, in spite of the fact that Pukeahu was actually a place where many of them were imprisoned. There was a prison built on top of Pukeahu that had a lot of conscientious objectors put in there during the First World War. But none of that history is visibly evident in the park today. And so, just like music is made up of notes, it's also made up of the space in between the notes. And history is the same in the sense that there are things that are very visible in the landscape, things that are calling upon us to remember a certain person or event, but there are also silences. And sometimes those silences don't remain silent. And so, for instance, here, the picture on the right, that's Queen Victoria. Actually, the Queen Victoria is on both of those. The one on the left's just down from me here on Kent and Cambridge Street at the base of Mount Victoria, which is a suburb of Wellington, which takes its name from her. But the one on the right's in Winnipeg, Canada. And it speaks to a history where, for a long time, Indigenous folk in First Nations peoples in Canada held on to the stories of mass graves of children who were put in residential schools that were designed to strip away culture and language. And the bodies of these children actually were unearthed and are being unearthed. You may be aware of what's been happening over there. And so they didn't remain silent. The bodies themselves spoke into that space. And as a result, Queen Victoria was targeted. She was toppled. She was the monarch during which the residential schools were created. It's not necessarily that she was the one who designed the policy of residential schools, but she was seen as a legitimate target. And I guess the interesting thing is we've seen through the Black Lives Matter, and even here in Aotearoa, and I'll show you some examples of some of our colonial markers that have created quite a lot of, and continue to create quite a lot of division in society. And so this is a very relevant topic, and to explore it with students and to get them thinking about what to do with some of our historical markers. One way to support them think critically about the issue is to provide them with a language which actually a local historian, Ewan Morris, talks about, the language of arithmetic. So I found it really useful to talk with students about, we can begin with division. And so there are certain historical markers in the landscape that divide people. People have different perspectives on. What to do in response? Well, we can use the arithmetic of addition. So we can add to the monument or the memorial. We can say, well, actually, you know, since this was erected in, I don't know, 100 years ago, our thinking has changed. As soon as you put up a monument, you know, you're ossifying a certain perspective in time. And of course, our thinking shifts, and history is always written in the present. And so one response is we can update these markers or these memorials by saying, actually, this is also a perspective that has grown around this person or this event. Something else we can do is subtract. Like Queen Victoria there, we can remove these markers from the landscape. Now, this is sometimes challenged by historians who don't tend to like the idea of destroying so-called evidence or sanitizing the past. However, others feel like this is a very legitimate and a simple response to something that a person or an event that may celebrate oppression. And so we've got some good examples here in Aotearoa where people and names have been subtracted from the landscape. It tends to then breed a kind of response of cancel culture. But for students to be able to use this language and to think through these ideas using this language of arithmetic is quite powerful. And finally, there's multiplication. So this is the idea that groups who have tended to be marginalized or silenced in terms of their stories not being exposed in the landscape have the opportunity to create art or some kind of monument that speaks to their stories. And what those might be would be interesting for students to think through. Here's some local or national, I should say, examples. So we have there Hamilton being subtracted from the landscape. Von Tempsky, I understand, is being taken out. Pukeahu Street is going to be the new name for Von Tempsky Street in the Waikato. The top left is, for a long time in Berempore, Wellington, there was Waripori Street, which was a corruption of the name Te Whare Pauri, who was Te Āotearoa chief of Wellington. And so that has kind of like, I guess, an example of addition, but then now we have Waripori has been taken away. So we have the actual correct spelling and of Te Whare Pauri. Governor Grey there still stands, that's in Tamaki Makaurau, but becomes, and it's very contentious, you know, the figure who ordered the invasion of the Waikato gets defaced quite a bit and is a target, but still has remained. I know there's also a monument in Otahuhu, I think it is, of Marmaduke Nixon, very contentious, very divisive, and yet still stands. Whether or not he may be subtracted or whether there'll be some additional information supplied about his role in the Waikato War, yeah, that's an open corridor. So it's very much a live issue. And students, I think, giving them this language around how to respond to these divisive colonial markers, it's really helps their critical thinking. Another thing that is important for them to think through is that monuments are linked between three different situations. There's the event itself, which the marker refers to. Then after the event, at some point, the construction of the actual historical marker. And then the really important part for students when they come to Pukeahu is them in front of that marker in the present, hopefully learning something from it. But all of those layers and times have their own context, historical context, and the important thing is for students to, rather than just kind of passively engage with a historical monument or a marker, is to actually engage critically in a dialogue and to ask questions of it. questions such as these, who built it, when, who's it for, why is it here in particular, what's the message, who's the intended audience, does it serve the purpose for which it was intended, and also, importantly, why is there no marker here? Why is there no marker to conscientious objectors or the New Zealand land wars, for instance? And this gets into the area of silences, which I know that Laura is going to speak a bit more on. But Michelle Rolfe Trullo reminds us that any historical narrative is a bundle of silences. And I think it's a really powerful perspective to, keep in mind that there's no grand master account of the past. Historians are very comfortable with this idea. And as educators, I think just for us to be continually reminding ourselves of the biased and partial nature of historical narratives. And so while historical markers may be a way to try to generate a collective memory, to be also always thinking of what's not remembered. And even when there is a memorial, to think through the potential omissions. So this one here is just right outside my office. It's in Pukeahu Park. It was put in 2019 on about the 100-year anniversary of the outbreak of the influenza pandemic. Obviously, it's pretty topical right now in terms of living through a global pandemic currently. This is a really good example of what I see as having a very loud silence within it. So it talks, it's not a lot of text in here. It talks about the number of New Zealanders who died during the influenza pandemic, about the health professionals who volunteered to risk their lives, and how the disaster shaped modern approaches for future generations. It doesn't tell us anything about New Zealand's role in allowing the pandemic to spread in Samoa. So it was New Zealand administration who allowed the Te Lune ship to berth in Apia, which led to around 24% of the Samoan population to die from influenza, which is a massive, massive impact. But we don't learn that from this memorial. And so the question becomes, should that be in this memorial, New Zealand's national influenza pandemic memorial? And if it should, why isn't it in here? So we can talk through, I guess, for students to be always mindful that while they're going to learn something from these memorials, those questions about what's not being included are really important to ask. So this diagram I've found really useful to think in terms of simplifying what's going on in the construction of historical knowledge. And again, it comes to the question as being so pivotal. Before groups come to Pukeahu, I'm contacting with the teacher and trying to find out from them if students are carrying out any research or inquiry, what are their questions? What are the concepts that they're exploring? Because really the research and the construction of knowledge begins with the historian and their question or questions. And obviously in this day of information kind of saturation, the question has never been more important. In the past, I suppose we had librarians who acted as filters for information, but with the internet, there is no filter now. And with the spread of disinformation and misinformation, to allow or to offer students the capacity to think critically about what information they're consuming has never been more important. And so while we go with our question and find traces of the past, we can't obviously go back in time, but we find traces of it through the evidence that we find, and that then supports the creation of our interpretation, which are then filtered through big ideas such as mana, whakapapa, change, perspectives, obviously causes, and the creation of new knowledge. But if we just focus here a bit on evidence and developing students' inbuilt kind of bullshit detectors, if you like, for want of a better word, we can ask the question, is the information that or the text that students are getting information from legit? And that acts as a kind of mnemonic. So there are lots of different mnemonics out there. Actually, there's a There's an Indigenous model called Rauru Whakarere that Waikato University have created, but this one here I find really, yeah, has quite powerful, and students, you can use part of it with younger students. Just label is enough, really. You know, talking to them about when they buy clothing, we check the label, right? You want to know how much your shirt's going to cost. You may be a conscious consumer. You want to know if it's made in New Zealand rather than a sweatshop overseas. So you check the label. And the same as when you consume information, we should be asking who's writing this? What do we know about them? What do we know about the website? When was it written? And how does that impact what's been, what information is being conveyed? Evidence is related to what perspectives are included in the text. Are there any silences or groups that aren't being included? Genre is simply what kind of source is it? Primary, secondary. The intention. Why does this text exist? For what purpose? Is there an intended audience for it? And then tone. How does it sound? You know, trying to get students thinking through about ideas of bias or not. And so legit is one tool that students can use to evaluate information. And as I mentioned, you know, in this age of mass information saturation and disinformation, this is a hugely, you know, cross-curricular and lifelong important skill for students to develop, I think. Just to touch on a couple of historical concepts, the thinking about change at Pukeahu, and when thinking through history, you know, change is such a big concept that it's kind of ever present. And one way that I like to break down change is into 3 parts. They're not mutually exclusive. They all overlap, but it just helps when thinking about describing change. And the first is around the nature of change. You know, what kind of change are we talking about? Social, political, economic, cultural, environmental, etc. At what speed is the change happening? So we're obviously going through a lot of rapid environmental change currently with climate change, for instance. But change may be slow or gradual, and it may depend on the group, and that can cover extent. How widespread or is the change? Is it limited to a certain group, or is it across you know, all demographics, for instance? So yeah, that's I guess just a way into thinking through with students when talking about change. And then finally thinking about navigating perspectives and representations. And so this, I think, can be quite useful if you're in a gallery or an exhibition space. Thinking about these spaces as highly constructed, curated, that are sharing a particular narrative. And so getting students to think through who they think is telling the narrative and why, how it might be if someone else might tell the story. So for instance, if a Samoan New Zealander was putting together the influenza pandemic memorial, I'd imagine that, you know, wouldn't be surprising for me that they would mention the Talune and the impact that had in Samoa, and how different groups may tell a story differently. Again, the idea of silences, identify missing narratives, and Laura's about to talk about this. I think that with the Scale of Our War exhibition, there are some groups who are quite silent there. And then predicting why they might be missing. So how might a particular group benefit from missing this part of the narrative, and why it might be absent. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope some of that's been of use, and I'll pass it over to Laura.
Tēnā koe, Ricky, and namahi nui ki a koutou, and welcome to the middle part of this Dream Team presentation that we have today. I'm going to start by showing you this slide, which gives you a really good guide as to what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be thinking about museum exhibitions and how they can be really powerful sites for developing critical thinking skills with students that come and visit us. I do use these. I use Gallipoli a lot to develop critical thinking skills, which is why I'm talking about it today. But I also use the art galleries and use something called visual thinking strategies, which I've talked about before in a previous webinar. I think exhibitions really are sources of information, and where possible, it's a great idea to develop critical thinking around the content on show. When older students are visiting, so in terms of Gallipoli, that tends to be years 7 and up, we have a moment to capture their attention and to engage with historical content in new ways. Asking the students, if possible, to engage with the exhibition itself as well and think about how the content has been presented, it can be a great way to encourage critical thinking. Essentially, what we're doing is asking the students to analyse source material, in this case the exhibition, in the same way as they'd be asked to analyse information in a book or a film. And this might be seen as challenging, could be seen as challenging, but I believe it's just one aspect of what we do and what we should be doing. Teachers would be asking their students to do this in the classroom, or they certainly should be, and we're just presenting another opportunity for students to think critically and independently. So the next slide. Thank you, Mel. I couldn't quite find a photo of what I wanted to show you, but this will kind of like do in its place. And this slide, if you know the Gallipoli exhibition, I'm making an assumption that people do know the exhibition. There is a section early on where we have a presentation of information on a topographical map, and it basically shows the troop movements of the Anzac troops and the Turkish troops that are there. And there's a map on the wall, and it's similar to this map, but it has some flags on it as well. And the flags show, the flags there are the British, the Australian, the New Zealand, and the Turkish flags, even though there were also other countries represented at Gallipoli. But that's not on show in this situation. So one of this slide is really about powerful questions. You know, the power of a well-phrased question, really. So questions are one of the tools that we have to help students think deeply about content on show. So when we're standing in front of this part of the exhibition with the map on the wall in front of us, I ask a fairly innocent sounding question, and I say, why are the Turks there? We look at the flags and I say, why are the Turks there? And there's a pause usually, and one of the students will say, oh, because it's their country. Now, it may sound like a small, insignificant question and a small answer, but it's actually not. It's a really powerful answer, because what has happened there is that we've just flipped the narrative and we've started to talk about Gallipoli as a land which was invaded. And then, of course, you can move on to talk about, well, who are the invading forces? You know, and of course, it's the Allies. And what you're doing there is I am flipping that narrative really early on in the exhibition, and I can consolidate it by asking further questions of the students, like, well, who knows this land better than anybody else? Answer, the Turks. Who is going to defend? Who really is invested in defending this land? Answer, the Turks. And, you know, we've then kind of like actually started to shift people's thinking around Gallipoli, and certainly shifted it away from rather kind kind of traditional narratives around Gallipoli and traditional and some myth making that takes place. And so that's, you know, we're not here to create myths. We're here to bust myths with students. So that's an example of a powerful question. If we could move on to the next slide. Thank you, Mel. So I've chosen just two of the large scale figures to talk about because they do a lot of heavy lifting for me in the exhibition and actually help illustrate, you know, the focus of this talk. There are a couple of quotations that I've included on the slides. What they do is those quotations represent what Percival Fenwick was thinking and feeling to a large extent. We have information like this because people tended to write lots of diaries then and write letters, of course. So we can capture what was going on inside their heads and also inside their hearts, really. And it's one of the strengths of the exhibition is that it does that. So whilst it might sound like I'm being critical of the exhibition in parts, I'd like to acknowledge that it does have some really, you know, great strengths to it as well. So Percival Fenwick is a doctor, and so that's interesting to note. And one of the first questions that you can ask in front of Percival Fenwick, and I do, is why is he looking so sad? And that's, again, quite a straightforward question, and it tends to result in students just reading the information that's presented to them. So they might say something like, oh, he knew that the dead soldier in front of him, or he was related to the dead soldier in front of him. And so what they're doing is they're making a fairly good kind of inference, I guess, based on the information that's presented. But I want them to go deeper. So the second question, can we think of wider and deeper reasons to explain his sadness? Well, what I'll do in between those two questions is I'll insert some information. So the information I will give the students is talk about the fact that he is a doctor of many years' experience, signs up to, you know, help soldiers within Gallipoli, arrives and finds he's got, you know, his medical kit consists of largely bandages, antiseptic cream, basic painkillers, and that's about it. He doesn't have the tools at his disposal to really help these soldiers who actually need to go into surgery and in order to save their lives. And Percival Fenwick can't do anything about that. There's no hospital ship at this point in Gallipoli. That arrives later on with the Maheno is the name of that ship, and we'll talk about that in a moment with our next figure. But at this time, early on in Gallipoli, he's got very little tools at his disposal as a doctor to help the men who are suffering from appalling wounds. Then you can now ask that question again. Why is he sad? And of course, it's now a little bit more resonant. I've given the students a bit more information, and that allows them to make some greater and deeper inferences. And they can now understand that maybe he's actually feeling sad because of the lack of equipment, because of his inability to do his job. And that's quite a powerful moment for the students. So timing your questions, placing information just so is really, really useful. So drip feeding information, if you like, just so much, and then asking another question can be really, really a great way to get students to go a little bit deeper. So in general, what we're doing is asking students to analyse evidence presented and to make sense of historical perspectives on show. And by doing this, we can also encourage them, of course, to consider missing perspectives and voices, as Ricky was alluding to and talking about in his section. So, for example, within Gallipoli, there are no references to conscientious objectors. There are few references to the impact of war on people left at home. Hardly any mention of soldiers from the Pacific who joined up to fight. Are these issues? Well, yes, they are. I mean, by the way, you will find information about Pacific soldiers on level 4 in Tangata o Le Moana in Te Papa, but no, not within the Gallipoli exhibition. And it's worth considering that we, yes, there are issues around this, but we have to work with this. This is the exhibition we're working with. Therefore, what can we do to fill the gaps? And sometimes we do find ourselves in that situation of having to fill gaps, basically. So this exhibition, like all exhibitions really, gives a voice to selected viewpoints as it's curated. Looking at what viewpoints are on show should inevitably lead to a consideration of the viewpoints that are missing. So could we go on to the next slide, please, Mel? Thank you. So Lottie Le Gallais. Again, we're sort of thinking further about missing voices, and questions again can lead us into more critical territory. You know, women, the role of women in war is something that is very, I'm going to say quite lightly touched upon in Gallipoli. Lottie Le Gallais was a nurse who signed up to go and obviously sort of do her duty helping soldiers. She arrives in Gallipoli on the hospital ship, the Maheno, when it arrives. And one of the first things we can do when we're looking at Lottie is, again, to ask a really simple, straightforward question. Why is she crying? And students will always kind of make a fairly good connection with the letter she's holding in her hand. Of course, you know, for those of you who can't remember or don't know, the connection is that she's crying because she'd been writing letters to her brother Leddy, who was fighting at Gallipoli, and saying to him that she was looking forward to meeting up with him because she was on board the Maheno and they'd be docking Gallipoli. She gets all of these letters that she's written. These are her letters sent back to her unopened because Leddy has never opened them because Leddy had been killed. And on the front of these letters is stamped deceased, returned to sender. Now, that's pretty brutal, and we talk about that, we unpack that with the students, and they can fully understand why it is that Lottie is crying. And goodness me, she's got plenty to cry about. And by the way, she has the longest dwell time of any of the large-scale figures in the Gallipoli exhibition. And I don't think it's accidental. I think it's entirely connected to her crying. There's a sort of release of emotion, if you like, that people respond to. But we can go deeper. We don't want to just leave it there, because we have an opportunity here to really talk a bit more deeply about the Gallipoli exhibition and the role of women. So I point out to the students that there are no men crying. So by this point, we've seen a lot of male soldiers. None of them are crying. And then the next question that I ask is, does this mean that men didn't cry? Again, I just ask it quite innocently. And I do believe that, questions can be so powerful. And if you want to present information, it's better actually to ask a question. So does this mean that men didn't cry? And again, there's usually a bit of a pause. And really all the students, and I've never had this not happen, all the students say, no, of course they did. Now, it's interesting that, because there's been no presentation of men crying in the exhibition, but the students all understand that, yes, of course they would cry. And by the way, this is not me rewriting history from a 21st century perspective. We know that men cried. We have evidence that men cried from diary entries and from letters, and we also have it from witness accounts that were taken soon after the end of the First World War, which have been, recorded. So we do know that men cried, and we talk about, I ask the students to imagine then what men would have cried about, what would have reduced a man to tears. And they come up with a whole variety of answers, and they really, really get into this conversation. And of course, we're talking about, you know, really emotional engagement here, and the power of historical empathy here too. If there are older students, but though having said that, I actually do ask this of, you know, year 7 up. I say, should there be a man crying? And sometimes you'll get some debate about that, but because I don't have very much time to develop that, I usually leave that in the hands of the students to go away with. And I suggest to the teacher that they might want to have a debate within their classroom and talk about, should actually Te Papa have had a man crying? And there we're just, in a sense, all I'm doing is getting them rolling, you know, giving them a really kind of, you know, meaty question to take away with them to develop further. And I think that's really something good that we can do as well. If we don't always have the time or the space to do these things within the exhibition, maybe we can send it back with the school. By the way, I do certainly think that there should be a man crying, and I think that would alter the exhibition quite considerably. And initially, you might be interested to know, there was a suggestion that there would be no women in the exhibition at all. It would just be male soldiers. If I've got older history students, say years 12 and 13, I might mention that to them. And, you know, everybody feels how wrong that would have been. It's quite interesting to mention it to students in order for them to kind of understand that there could have been no women in this exhibition, and to feel that absence is actually quite powerful, I think. Should we draw attention to these missing voices? Well, yes, I think we can, and we should do this. All exhibitions decide which viewpoints to give prominence to, and decide which ones that are not going to be given prominence to at all. By allowing students to consider this, we're allowing them to question received narratives, and we're asking them to infer information and to critically engage with ideas. It also changes the dynamic of the session from passive to active involvement. I think that we're creating engaged and critical citizens, and modelling to teachers that this can be an engaging approach to history. And I think that's all very, very important given the context that we're in, with regard to the renewed focus on Aotearoa New Zealand histories and the new curriculums. And so I'm going to finish off with my last slide, thank you, Mel, which is a soldier doll. And I'll just tell you a little bit about this. So this isn't on display in the exhibition, but it is one of my favourite items in the Te Papa collections. This object tells an amazing story about the impact of war on one New Zealand woman. So Dorothy Broad was the maker, and she made this doll to represent her fiance. Wyville, I can't remember his last name at the moment, but he was always just known as Wyville to her. And he went off to war. She made this incredibly, it's about so big. And it's got an incredible amount of detail on it, including a little wristwatch, which is modelled on his wristwatch, which is very beautiful. He went off to fight. He survived. He got through Gallipoli, and he got through the Western Front as well in Europe. But he died of the flu, as so many people did around the world, and didn't make it home. And Dorothy Broad didn't ever marry at all. And this soldier doll, which represented her fiance, stayed with her for the rest of her life. Now, it's a really emotional story. I think it's wonderful. And how interesting, you know, well, one thing to consider is, you know, Dorothy Broad didn't go to war, but was she impacted by war? Yes, she was very much impacted by war. And we're widening the kind of narrative around war when we think about these objects. How interesting would it be if this object and maybe others had a space in the Gallipoli exhibition? How much wider would the narrative about war be? and how much more emotional would the connections be as we would empathize with the person at home during wartime. You know, imagine an exhibition which focused solely on the impacts of war on those left behind. So I'm going to leave it there and just encourage everyone to be really courageous. Over to you, Tereora.
Kia ora everyone. Ko Tereora hau. I'm a senior specialist, education specialist with the National Library of New Zealand. I can actually confirm that I was crying off camera, so men do cry. I was crying because I was nervous. But I can also confirm that the best part of this presentation is now over. And for those of you who want to stick around, I'm going to say some things. I am always with these presentations feel very humbled to be asked to present, but also, you know, when you see people in the participants list who've logged on, like, it's just lovely to actually connect with colleagues from around the country, and what we do is amazing, and I am an unashamed praiser of what we do, and I think we're a really important part of what's going on in Aotearoa right now, and we are what we do deserves for us to some time to think about and reflect upon, and which Laura and Ricky have done so amazingly at the first part, and I'll try and get close to their standard. I've just titled mine some thoughts for educators and facilitators and guides in the culture and heritage sector. I'm going to take a different run slightly. I'm going to talk about us and talk about our role as educators, a little bit more about what qualifies us. So I'm going to kick off, if that's all right. And I've got a little stopwatch thing that you guys can't see over here, a little clock, which is going to make me amazing. So I have a singular proposition today, and hopefully by the end of my presentation that will be obvious, and if it's not, then I'll probably never get asked back. And it comes from a single question, and the question is, what qualifies you and I to lead, encourage and challenge young minds to be critical actors? Because I don't know about you, but I feel really, really privileged to have the role that I do. Not just because my boss is in the participant list, my manager. I'm not just saying that because it's end of year PLD time and see how I did the year before. But I've been, like many of you here, and I can see my old colleague from Auckland, New Zealand, Muriel Le Gallais from Christchurch. Feel really privileged to do the role that I do, and what I mean by that is, you know, to actually have young minds come to where you work, and you have the role of sharing information, providing experiences, but also providing questions and guiding their learning, even for a short time in their educational journey. That's a massive privilege. To work alongside and represent some of the taonga that of Aotearoa that we work with, that's a massive privilege. So what do you do in that with your privilege? What do you do in that moment? And I guess this is what I want to talk about. What qualifies us in that moment? And I've got some things that I'd really like to say. So I don't have control over the slides, but anyway. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about the courage of being a critical actor. So this is me. This is me trying to pretend that I had it all together in front of an exhibition that I was asked to do. I'd never done an exhibition before, and through nepotism, no, not nepotism, but through knowing the right people or just turning up at the wrong meeting, I got asked to be the exhibition developer and project lead for the 2014 150th commemoration of the Battle of Gate Park. And as you can see, I placed my arms inside my biceps so they look bigger for this publicity photo. And again, that's kind of, yeah, that's just me. But that's me, undoctored. But this is me with an absence of critical thinking. That's, yeah. Without critical thinking, this is what can happen. You can imagine all sorts of things about and shift your reality. I grabbed this photo because someone did it, because I made a joke about my physique once, and then someone did this. It was actually Mel, but anyway. So there are problems with when there's an absence of critical thinking, or benefits, depending on how you're using the information or images. Anyway, we can move on. No one needs to see that for longer than you need to. Critical thinking and the expression of it takes courage, and all my slides have, my formatting seems to have gone up the cack a little bit. This is going well. Can someone give me a thumbs up? You can't, I don't know if you can read that, but critical thinking to me, I think, takes courage. It takes courage for us to step into places where Laura talked about myth, to step into places where myths persist, and some very strong ones, especially our narratives and stories become hallowed national, strongly held beliefs about who we are as a country. And Gallipoli is certainly one of those stories. I grew up with that, and it was glorious. It was tragic, but that actually enhanced the glory of it, the sacrifice of that New Zealanders made. But they were all men, of course, and men sacrificed themselves. What were women doing? No one ever mentioned it. Of course, they were just sitting at home, supporting the war effort happily in factories and raising fat, dairy-fed children. But when I was thinking about the courage that it takes sometimes to stand against, or to at least contend with narratives and cultural fabric that you think needs to be unpicked and contended with. Sometimes it takes, there are times when you have to say things that some of your other colleagues in our institutions, it goes against the run of play. And I just thought this picture that Mel's going to put up in a sec really captures that spirit to me. Now, some of you will have seen this picture before, and it's an amazing photo that was taken. And at the time, it wasn't taken of the man in the circle. It was just taken of some German shipyard workers in 1936. And the context of this is that Adolf Hitler, who I think had just recently become Chancellor of Germany, was passing by. And all of the shipyard workers were summoned out of the factory to give this Nazi salute and take part in this narrative of nationalism and ascendancy that was happening in Germany at the time. But if you look at that photo, there's one guy. If you look closely, there's one guy. He's not saluting. And so I did a bit of research about this, as wasn't that hard. His name is August Landmesser. And August Landmesser was a shipyard worker in 1936. But he began to run foul of local authorities and certainly the Nazi Party, because he had a Jewish girlfriend. And he didn't like some of the things that were being said about the Jews, and he loved her. In fact, he hid it as long as he could. But when he was confronted, and he said, if you the authorities said to him, if you don't toe the line here, you're going to be in trouble. Well, he didn't toe the line, and what happened is he was arrested, and he got in a lot of trouble, and he was put in prison, and eventually he was pressed into service with the Wehrmacht in World War II, and he dies, I think, in Croatia or Serbia, in a battle. But I just look at that photo and I think to myself, what courage does someone have to amongst all of those people, to say, no, I'm not down with this? And I think that's something that, we're all inspired by different things, but I just wanted to share that and then move on. I think you've got to want to desire to be part of the massive work that's going on in our country. And we are re-examining our narrative, our national narratives, and turning over and looking underneath our narratives, as both Ricky and Laura have talked about. That's not easy. And some days I feel Aotearoa groaning under this work. We are groaning. And it should be pointed out that tangata whenua have been groaning for over 180 years. And some of us snowflakes are groaning about some of the things that have just emerged. But we are doing it. And what is our place in that? I think it's critical. I think we're critical to that role. And I just want to talk about how I see these things, why I do what I do, and I'm sure some of you can relate. This one is mahi rangatira. This is our work, I believe, is leadership. I believe we are, when we critique and when we ask difficult questions, when we do the work on ourselves, that's leadership. It's moving into spaces that maybe haven't been there before, and sometimes other people around us don't want to follow. Sometimes there are people in our classes that come in, sometimes adults, that will find the things that we're talking about contentious. But it's a work of leadership. It's a work of manaakitanga. It is us taking responsibility as hosts in our spaces for people's experiences, our young people's experiences. And when I say experiences, not just, wow, I went to the museum and saw this, but actually we're taking responsibility for the altering processes, for the questioning processes. It is a work of being a great host and taking responsibility for not just the learning process, but also their well-being in that process. Because when you go at some of these critical questions, you have to kind of look after people at the same time, and they take really important skills. Next one, thanks, man. It's a work of kaitiakitanga. We have to look after people. We have to look after our organisations, and be careful and diligent caretakers and a safe pair of hands, not just for the taonga, not just for the work that's been created by curators, but for the work that teachers are also trying to do with their young people. Thank you. I love this meme. I stole it off Facebook, and I have not attributed it because I can't remember where I got it. Whenever a child learns critical thinking, somewhere a conspiracy theory dies. Many of us can face some of that stuff, and I just want to remind you that actually conspiracy theories go back a long, long way. There wouldn't be a class that comes into my space at He Tohu Tamaki and learning around te tiriti, around he whakaputanga and our formative history there. There wouldn't be a class, or there wouldn't be a day where I'm asking, what do you know about who was here first in Aotearoa, that some child says, what about the Moriori? That's a conspiracy theory. It was invented for a particular purpose to, and it's a powerful one because it's perpetuated for, 180 years. Some of these other conspiracy theories floating around, like someone stole an election in the States, you guys are lightweights. Our ones are long. These are tupuna conspiracy theories. Next one, please. Preparation. First one, preparedness. From our own work of critique, we need to be sharp and know the breadth, not only of the legitimate knowledge around our topics, but actually the stuff that's coming in from the side sometimes that we might regard as not from credible sources. I think we need to actually consider those things as well, because they might come into your frame of experience, and if they do, you know, the kid that asks, or the teacher that asks, or the adult that asks, any participant that asks that question that comes from a non-credible source, if you just fudge it and go, oh, that's not from a credible source, that's not good enough, I don't think. That's not being human. That's not us realizing that the complexity of the environment we find ourselves in. It's good to be able to help in a very gracious way, help people, lead them back to why these opinions are credible and these ones may not be credible. We need to be across all the stuff. I think it's really important for us to develop a range of, and think about the critical questions that come in and develop a range of responses. I always try and think what's coming into our space in regards to this, what people are learning, and try and think beyond what the worst case scenario, if you know what I mean, what's the worst question that could come, and how am I going to deal with that? I'm going to try and push on. I think it's important to be really aware of the topical conversations and contentions in our community and the wider world. It's just about being prepared. This is not me saying we have to know everything. It's the rigor of being an educator. And like it has been mentioned, confronting and critiquing myths and unhelpful perspectives. Can we just flick on there, please? But I think the most important thing that we should be doing is critiquing ourselves, our biases, our processes of enculturation. The New Zealand that I grew up in didn't leave me fit for purpose to understand the New Zealand that is now. And so I reveal that often to students. I will talk about that and say, my generation believed yada, yada, yada. But actually, as a scholar or as a person who's informed myself, I've been able to find out. And actually, that process is really interesting for young people. And I talk about lenses, the lenses that my upbringing left me with. And I've had to change some of those out. I'm just going to try and quickly press on as quickly as possible. These are my most circumspect and difficult students. Supporting parents. They're often the most circumspect, but I'd like to say they are often also the most engaged. Students want to ask questions after a presentation. They can't get past the student, their parent help that are going, hold on, wait a minute. I didn't learn about this at school. And that's important because they are always the elephant in the room with young people. When parents find out that their students are coming to He Tohu Tamaki to learn about Te Tiriti, parents all of a sudden then start rolling out their history learning with their children the night before. Oh, we're almost done. Sorry, I'm just going to quickly. A commitment to your craft, and I'm going to quickly go through these as quickly as I can, as opposed to the right answers. I'll just put that picture in that I was in school the other week, and we're seed planters. I've put in there mahi mara, and that's gardening. I approach the small frames of time that I have with young people as a gardener might. We have this opportunity, and we have seeds. We've been given seeds through our research. We are part of organisations that give us seeds to plant, and not necessarily the planting in young people, but giving the children the seeds. Hey, these are the seeds. You don't have to, you choose to plant them or not. Can we move on, please? Preparing the soil, relationships, whakawhanaungatanga with teachers, with conversations. Those are really, really important because that's just a practical sort of thing. If you have a great relationship with a teacher, or one that actually is warm and they trust you, man, kids are sensitive to those cues. They are watching their teacher. If their teacher is focused and engaged and connected with you, it guides. Exhibiting the tools of critical. I will often ask questions of myself in presentations. How do I know that? Where do I get my information from? Because I'm showing them there's a process, and actually that process is the thing that keeps going. I'm just trying to quickly get through as quick. I'm going over time. And actually, knowledge is a taonga. We are privileged to have the results of research and work by historians, by curators, and by people who have studied stuff. We have been handed that knowledge, and we're responsible for it. And just to finish, I can move on. Just to give you an example of of how I find myself in the headlights of critical thinking. I work for He Tohu, I work for government, and the principles of Te Tiriti, as handed down since 1984, are protection, participation, and partnership. And I meet teachers who come in and they're teaching their classes that. But on the other side, I have friends who are in iwi, who are working with government, and they are really critiquing these hallowed principles of protection, participation, and partnership, because they're like, hold on, none of our tupuna said anything about these things. We have our own principles in regard to our relationship with Te Tiriti and with everyone else in Aotearoa. And sometimes when everyone believes that this is the way, and you have to say, actually, there's some difficulties around that can put you in a contentious place. And if you ever find yourself in a place where there is not contention, it's time to maybe look at what's constructed around you. Thank you. Did you hear my bells going off? Okay, I'm going to stop. Kia ora, everybody.
Kia ora. Thank you, Tereora. Thank you, Laura. And thank you, Ricky. That was a really fantastic webinar. You covered so many really interesting things. I've been taking furious notes here. I love the language of basic arithmetic. I love the different time frames of memorials. You'll talk about the power of questions. And Tereora, your reminder that we're all in the process of critiquing ourselves, and we hold quite privileged roles in this work. So thank you so much. It's a really valuable resource. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but scanning the chat box, the one question that was put there earlier has actually already been answered by Ricky. Thank you, Ricky. So we'll move, and there's lots of people saying thank you. So yeah, that was a really fantastic webinar. So before we close off with karakia, I've just got a couple of things to let you know. We've just launched an online course on the Future Learn platform, enriching curriculum through culture and heritage in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's free, so go ahead and sign up. It's a 4-week course, and you get 4 weeks free to complete the course. And you don't have to follow the course right the way through. You can dip in and out to the bits that you find most interesting. I can see that some people who are on the call today are already enrolled in the course, so nice to have you on board as learners. There's one section of the course that is about Aotearoa New Zealand history, so it's quite pertinent for the topic on discussion today. We're taking a break from webinars for the school holidays, and the first webinar that we've got scheduled after the school holidays in the next term is 3 wonderful educators from Tairāwhiti who will be talking about kaupapa embedded programs at their museum, which will be really fantastic. So that's Thursday, 28th of July, usual time, 3:30 to 4:30. Okay, so I'll close us off with karakia. Unuhia, unuhia. Unuhia ki te uru tapunui, kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua i te ara takatā. Koia rā I rongo, whakairuria ki ake ki runga, kia tina, tina, uie, tae kie. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye. Ka kite anō.